Roy, take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the closing session of the Metropolis North America Migration Policy Annual Forum. My name is LeRoy Potts, and I'm Chief of the Research Unit in the Refugee, Asylum, and International Operations Directorate at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is a part of Homeland Security. I am also a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in Canada for the year 2021-2022. And it's an honor to chair the closing session, COVID-19 and Migration Futures in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Trends, Trust, and Cooperation. We have a truly distinguished panel that has been assembled this afternoon to discuss how COVID-19 has modified migration plans and patterns, and what this will mean for the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Cross-border movement between the three countries has played an important role in the economic and cultural relations between all. The panelists will discuss what the experience of the past year has taught us about immigration or migration and borders. First, I'll introduce Andrew Selee, who is the president of the Migration Policy Institute, a global nonpartisan institution that seeks to improve immigration and integration policies through fact-based research, opportunities for learning and dialogue, and the development of new ideas to address complex policy questions. He assumed the position of president in 2017, and he also chairs MPI's Europe's Administrative Council. We are joined by Professor Rodolfo Cruz Piniero, who is the director of the Department of Population Studies at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, Mexico, and director of El Colegio's International Migration Magazine. He has participated in a large number of research projects on the phenomenon of internal and international migration and the employment and labor markets of Mexicans from a sociological and demographic perspective. He has taught courses at El Colegio, the University of Texas at Austin, my alma mater, and San Diego State University. This main area of study is population and development of the United States-Mexico border, this main area of study. And we, of course, are joined by Jack Jedwab, who is president and CEO of Metropolis Canada, Metropolis North America, and president of the Association for Canadian Studies. His courses he has taught at the University of Quebec, Montreal, and McGill University. His courses have covered the history of immigration in Quebec, ethnic minorities in Quebec, official language minorities in Canada, public policy, and sports in Canada. He also regularly contributes to essays for books, journals, and newspapers across the country, in addition to authoring various publications and government reports on issues of immigration, multiculturalism, human rights, and official languages. So it's an honor, gentlemen, to have all of you. Who would like to go first?
Okay.
Jack?
I'll volunteer, actually.
All right.
All right, so let me share my screen. Let me also begin by saying thank you to Roy, and I want to thank my team. It's been a very active 2 days, so particular thanks to James Ondrick and to Chloe Nignol for all the hard work they've done, and to a number of other people in my team, Chris Tees and Jillian Aiken. Thank you very much for all the hard work, and to our co-chairs, Nancy Richard and David Hertel and Gustavo Mohar. Thank you all very much. It's been really fruitful series of exchanges, and so much appreciated, and look forward to continued collaboration as we go forward. Okay, so here we go. So let's see, I'm going to look at, where am I having some challenges here? There we go. Sorry, back, yes. So I'm going to look at some demographic issues and look at the impact of immigration and migration, specifically on those demographic issues, with a focus on what the COVID-19 impacts have been, at least over the sort of past year in particular. Let me start with this particular table. This has just come out on June 17th. These are demographic estimates that Statistics Canada provides. And what we see is due to the record high number of deaths and stable births at 89,758,000 for the first quarter of this year, natural increase, which we know to be births minus deaths, which is plus 6,379, dropped to its lowest level in any quarter that goes. This is going back to the third quarter of 1971. And so it's difficult to suggest that COVID-19 has not had a very substantial, and in this case, a record impact on demographic change in Canada, just looking at this particular relationship, right? As you can see in the red below, where we've seen a very substantial drop from quarter to quarter, 40% drop in net natural increase from Q1 2020 to Q1 2021, right? January to March. Here's also some highlights that I want to share with you. The first one we've gone over, but the second one. So with the low level of natural increase that we've just seen in the table, international migration accounted for a record 92.3% of population growth in the first quarter of 2021. That's the highest for any quarter since we've done any comparable records in the history of Canada. And that's because we've reverted, by the way, to in the first quarter of 2021 to the projected rates of immigration, because we had a substantial, as we all know, diminishing in the numbers of immigrants who admitted to the country over 2020, right, at the sort of year in which we sort of experienced, as we all know, the very serious effects of the contagion, which persist, even though we've seen a diminishing in cases, but we've nonetheless, adjusted to restoring our rates of international immigration to pre-COVID levels, despite the ongoing challenge from the pandemic. So in the first quarter of 2021, as I've just suggested, 70,473 people were welcome to Canada. Immigrants were welcome to Canada, again, back to pre-pandemic levels, and the highest number since the pandemic began in the first quarter of 2020. The number of immigrants is higher than the first quarters of 2020, 2019, but a bit lower than the first quarter of 2018. But all that to say is we're returning to where we were. And just as an example of one region of Canada, population growth rate in Alberta, 0.2 is the lowest first quarter growth in that province since 1984, mainly due to increased deaths, fewer immigrants, and interprovincial migration losses, right? Because Alberta's had been the sort of magnet for interprovincial migration, for people moving from other parts of Canada to, in this case, Alberta, which was for many years until recently the principal beneficiary of such growth, from such growth. Just to illustrate, population change in the US also has been affected. Deaths exceeded births in 46% of all US counties, a near record high. Between 2010 and 19, more people died than were born in 54% of the 1,974 rural counties in the nation. In contrast, just 24% of 1,166 urban counties had overall natural decrease. So the rising incidence of natural decrease, again, an important factor in demographic change across states and in the United States. It's important to understand the impact of future occurrence of this. And light of mortality increase and likely fertility decline stemming from COVID-19, this could have significant implications for rural demographic trends, as well as, of course, national demographic trends. Right? So, and we have been doing, as some of you know, a lot of polling, on a weekly and more recently bi-weekly basis, both in Canada and the United States, looking at all kinds of social issues, including attitudes towards fertility in the two countries. So we could see at this point, although again, we're not it's very hard to predict the future, even though I'm about to share some demographic trends with you about what the future looks like, but it's very hard to predict what people's attitudes will be coming out of the pandemic. And, as we, as that evolves in terms of issues of fertility and family and so forth. So 2010, back in still in the United States, 2010 to 2022 saw the lowest population growth in the United States in a 10-year period in over 100 years, right? So it's 7.4% population growth. We're about to see a lot of results from the 2020 census in the United States, right? There was census here last year. We've seen the beginnings of the rollout of some of the data, but we'll see more going forward. And we're also in a census period in 2021 here in Canada. We won't see our rollouts till really a bit in the fall, just for general population growth, but more in terms of the disaggregated or detailed data for identity-based groups more next year, right? Fall of next year, we'll see more of that data. Now, this is just 2100, these projections. I'm sorry, I'm going to move backwards. I'm projecting as far into the future. And no worries, folks, I'm not making any restaurant reservations for 2100. So, to see, what this will actually look like at that particular time. I don't expect to have that opportunity. But these are the population projections for 2100 that were released in January by the US Census Bureau, just to give us an idea of what as I call it, the sort of change in NAFTAN country share. It's a new term I've invented today. We're NAFTANs for purposes of today's discussion. Right? That's what Rodolfo and Andrew and Roy and I, and others share that are part of this. We're all part of the NAFTAN community. Remember, I'm copywriting that term, by the way. So if I hear it from anyone else going forward, I'll say, wait a second, folks, I introduced that term. So in terms of the NAFTAN population, right, the projection, so the current numbers of 332, 38, about 500 million total. We'll see, according to these projections, in 80 years from now, similar percentages or shares of US, Canada, Mexico occupying, the populations of the NAFTAN community, if you like. But growth rates we're expecting, in Mexico, at least this is what the US population experts who are working with international experts suggest, based on a series of trends that probably will need to be modified with what we've seen in the past year, unless the past year and a half is just a blip, which we don't know yet. So the annual growth rates, we're going to negative growth in Mexico at some point in the future. I'd have to sort of go decade by decade to get a handle on that. Canada, much lower growth rate than currently, and United States, lower growth rate than currently, right? So meaning immigration becomes increasingly important for, receiving countries that are determined to make population growth, really critical factor. This slide simply looks at the last 4 years and looks at what the differences were in terms of immigrant numbers. You could see in the United States and Canada, there was drop off in both countries, but the drop off from 2019 to 2020 in immigration was quite a bit larger in Canada than it was in the United States, right? So, despite the Trump presidency and some, well, I suggest some anti-immigrant discourse in the United States, a little heavier, certainly much more so than in Canada. We were the ones that invariably had the higher percentage reduction in immigration relative to the United States, right? So, all right, and that's over here. You can see 707, 184 in Canada, but now we're restoring our levels in the first quarter back to where they were in the 2019 period. So here's just a quick, and I'm going to start going quicker here. Here's the differences in Canada, United States, 2019 to 20, and where the reductions were felt most by countries of origin, right? So you can see here, Mexico, 50%, that's about, 2/3, 1/3 reduction, or 33% reduction in the total numbers of admissions from Mexico, 2019 to 20. Reduction here, but our migration from Mexico is relatively insignificant compared to the United States, and actually in terms of our overall numbers, it's not particularly significant either, right? That's also the case if you look at anything in Latin America or the Caribbean, Dominican Republic, much higher numbers in the United States, very few in Canada. India, much higher in Canada than it is in the United States, although 2020, it was pretty similar, right? But previous to that, 25% of Canada's overall immigration in 2019 and in preceding years came from India. In fact, this was our record for any single year from any country in the world, was our immigration from India in 2020, right? Otherwise, yeah, exactly. Philippines, more proximity there, right? But the United States naturally have larger immigration. Cuba, much more United States, virtually nothing in Canada. El Salvador, much more United States, virtually nothing in Canada, relatively speaking. Brazil, a little, well, more closer proximity there, but still much more United States. Anything from Central Latin America, much more influence in the United States. Canada, still a bit more proportionally more from China, India, Philippines, and parts of Europe, proportionally a bit more, like France. But, we're trying to attract more French-speaking immigrants here. So France, you've got similar numbers. Actually, Canada, a little bit more than the United States and France in 2020. US Census Bureau projects the demographic revolution, right? So as we do as well in terms of the impacts of higher immigration, lower birth rates, right? Especially lower birth rates for established groups. We're going to see much greater racial and ethnic pluralism. Non-Hispanic whites are projected to remain the single largest race, a term we don't use here in Canada, ethnic group for the next 40 years. As the population ages and grows more slowly in coming decades, the United States project to continue to become more pluralistic in that regard. And some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the types of projections that we're looking at, right? So in 1990, nearly 1 in 5 people were non-white. And over the next decade, that proportion continued to rise to 1 in 4. And we'll see that increase move even further. Here's projections for Canada, United States. 2000, this is earlier, 14 United States, 2036 scenarios. The thing I just want to illustrate here was, if you look at the United States, projection for 2036, and could rise even higher for Hispanic and Latin American, is 19.5%. In Canada, we're looking at 2%, right? So in the NAFTA community, we're going to see a much greater Hispanic presence in the United States, and cultural proximities, if you like, greater in between the United States and Mexico and and Latin America more generally, whereas Canada won't have that presence, right? So even though we have a substantial amount of temporary workers in our agricultural sector from Mexico, we don't have that sort of core community, if you like, in our NAFTA population, at least in the northern part of the NAFTA population, our part, that's of Hispanic origin, that's sort of having an important imprint on our demographic reality. But we do have in Canada a 22.6% projected population of persons from various Asian backgrounds, whereas in the United States, we're looking at 9%. So, that suggests more, ties with the Asia Pacific side of things, if we consider transnational and diaspora ties as important ties for culture and trade, more proximity there, although right now our relationship with China is not particularly good, I would suggest. Right? So, and then we get into the Hispanics, and increasing share of that NAFTA population, right? That's just the US projected populations. We're going to see big increases in the Hispanic population US going forward. Right? So we'll need more Andrew Selees to act as these sort of bridges between, that part of the NAFTA South. So, and just quickly, just going to close on this, just the long history of movements of the sort of northern NAFTAns to the US over the 20th century. We've seen a lot of movement in that regard. We did see a narrowing of the average loss of Canadians to United States, because more Canadians moved to the United States than Americans to Canada. We did see that narrow in 2011 to 2020, but over the COVID period, actually, in last year at least, in that 1 year, we actually saw a bit of a movement upwards. So we had a bigger negative net loss, looking a bit more like the negative net losses we had in the earlier part of the 2010 period, a little more than the two really good years we had here in 2018 and 2019, right, where we reduced those losses during the Trump period. Right, it seems that we seem to do better in terms of flows our way during those years of the Trump era, 18-19, but we're reverting back a bit to more movement to the US and not the Canadian movement. So that's just a bit of an overview. Hopefully, it helped to inform discussion. I apologize if I went over my time. I have a bad habit of doing that. And thanks very much, by the way, Andrew and Rodolfo. And hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation. And we intend to be much more active with Metropolis North America. So hopefully, when this all permits us to travel better than is the current situation, we can do this face to face and have a sort of more sort of fruitful exchange. Not that this isn't a fruitful exchange. It is a fruitful exchange. So, sorry. Thanks, Roy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Rodolfo, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you.
And you have a
Okay, let me share the presentation. Just first of all, let me give a thank you to Jack and all the people in Metropolis. It's good to see you here and see a very old friend, Andrew. How are you? And well, I will talk a little bit about the context of these changes in processes, migration processes in Mexico. And I have to tell you that, I'm sorry. We have had very different and deep changes in Mexico migration processes. In the last 15 years, we have had a very big changes. For many years in Mexico, we were talking about only out-migration, the Mexican out-migration, mainly to United States, a little bit to Canada, but mainly to United States. But in the last 15 years, we have had different processes of migration. We have had, of course, the out-migration, but also the Mexicans start to return into Mexico, and that is very important processes right now in Mexico. But also we have a specific deportation problems for Mexican who wants to come back to the regions. Also, we have an increasing process in international transit migration through Mexico, trying to reach the United States. But also with this, at the same time, these processes that an increase in asylum and refugees processes in Mexico. We can see that the out-migration to United States has declined very deeply since 2008. We had around 750,000 people was Mexican going to United States. Right now, in the beginning of the 2020 and 2021, we have seen around 45,000 people going to United States. The returning process, we can see still in the last 2 decades, we can see a huge, I would say, people from United States to Mexico coming back to Mexico. We can see in the 2010 around the 824, but we can see that continue the same pace, because if we add the two numbers, we can see is 815,000, 100,000 people coming back from United States to Mexico. But also, perhaps the most surprisingly and more called the attention for the media is these people, Central American, who are using Mexico to reach United States. We can see how is the number of the deportation from Mexican authority and US authority deportation from Central America. So the problem of the violence, insecurity, the poor countries of the Honduras, Salvador, Guatemala, we can see that is a huge number of people trying to reach United States. And that deportation number gives us an idea of this. What happened is in the last 5 years, in these northern border cities, we have received extraordinary flow of these immigrants. Many people call as a caravans, migrants in transit to the United States. People from Honduras, Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil, even people from extra-continental countries as African or another region of the world. So this is the big issue right now in the region, that we have a big increase of people coming using Mexico to reach the United States. But and also we have seen a tremendous change in this profile, has more children, more women trying to cross irregular way to reach United States. This gives us an idea also that these people that they cannot reach United States, they are trying to asking or applicants for recognition of refugees status in Mexico. That we have seen a tremendous increase. In 2019, we have seen reaching 70,000 people asking for this recognition of refugees in Mexico. In the 2020, because the COVID, it was not too many people, but right now in the 2021, we already in June, we reached the 2020 numbers, and it seems that for the end of this year in 2021, we will reach the 70 or perhaps more, 70,000 people or more asking refugees in Mexico. So this is a very new for Mexico. And Mexican, we were not prepared to receive too many people in this category recognition of refugees. So we have people right now in several cities in Mexico that are living in this category. Um, what happened with the COVID emergency? Well, in March 20 and 2020, the United States-Mexico border was closed for all non-essential travel. The U.S. closes the border of the ground and health risk public. Under the title, the 42 came into force, which provide a no crossing essential. The Mexican, on the other side, the Mexican government began to receive Central American asylum seekers that they were immediately expelled by the United States under the Title 42. But also migration in this region was completely affected during the COVID. It was a closed border and the migration flows was very down. But the illicit traffic has continued to develop. Although migration flow have decreases in the beginning in 2020. So this problem that is still, even the border has been closed, the illicit migration is still there. Irregular border crossing continued in more isolated and dangerous corridor on the border, where expulsion of migrants were frequently made under the Title 42. Again, the social civil, the ONGs and the society more organized and shelters for migrants announced the temporary suspend a new admission to the facility in order to prevent contagion. Uh, the US announced the suspension for all asylum applicants process and closed under the migration, the MPP, the Migration Protocol Protection Protocol Program. And under the contingency for COVID, emergency care of migrants, registered organized civil society, and many shelters were locked down. And the first month of the pandemic of the lockdown aim reduce the risk of the spreading the virus of the shelter met this objective. This is the number of shelters in Mexican northern border. We can see for the major border cities, Mexican border cities. And this is the point right now, perhaps the most difficult problem for the Mexican government. We have many immigrants living on the borders, in the shelters, or even right now in some small houses, and they are working because the US ended the MPP program and they start to receiving for asylum asking people, but the process is very slow. So right now, these people is in these areas, and right now it's more than 11,000 people, but still we can see much more people in these border areas. Uh, Under the COVID-19, the shelters adopted some strategies. All reduced the offer of the accommodation to guarantee the application of healthy distance and regulate the exit and entrance. Some shelters decide to admit a few people per day or per week. Some other shelters decide to accept only people who had a medical certificate. In other cases, they continue to operate, but behind the closed door that maintained the same population without accepting new income. And in some areas, such as Piedras Negras, the shelters, they ordered to complete closure of these shelters, and they continue closed to these days. I will share with you some results of the survey of the project the COVID-19 differential impact of the indigenous people and newcomers, socioeconomic analysis of Canada, US, and Mexico. And that is a very interesting data that gives an idea what the immigrants are perceiving about the COVID. For example, we asked about if they have changed their life, the personal life with the COVID, and most of the people they say that they have changed a lot, or other people say change a little. But most of them they say that we have changed. But also about the fear about this pandemic COVID, most of the people has afraid. They feel this afraid of to feeling these pandemic issues. If we ask if they intend to get vaccination against COVID, and most of the people say yes, but still we have people they don't know, or they say we will not have a vaccine for them. So this is very important because many people of this immigrant, they don't want to be vaccinated for on COVID. If right now in the second wave, we have in March of 2020, most of these immigrants have not been vaccinated. For the personal opinion, they think that the worst of the crisis is behind. They say they think that they are right now no more worried about the COVID. And finally, let me present some projection of the Mexican population, but mainly the out migration in three scenarios: the high, the medium, and low for the rate of out migration to United States, because most of the people are Mexican migrant to United States. We can see how I would say that for the low, because the situation right now in Mexico, and it seems for the government has more control of the border, it seems that the out migration of Mexico will keep it low. It seems like in these days. They have more control on the border, and people, it seems, not taking risks to cross the border in undocumented way. So this is a very numbers of in the low rate of out migrant. We can see people from this group of age 15 to 44. We can see around 37,040 people in the year 2030 or 2035. So it seems that this out-migration of Mexican to United States, it will be no more continued growing, instead it's going down. But my question perhaps will be with this new program of infrastructure of Biden implemented in the next months, that could be a call for many migrants trying to reach again United States. We don't know if we'll continue the migration to United States in a high level. I don't think so that will occur. I will thinking that this Mexican emigration to United States will keep in low as in this day. Well, thank you, and this is what I have for you. Thank you very much.
I'll dive in, Roy. Great to be with Rodolfo and Jack, and great to see Roy again. I've known for a while, and Rodolfo even longer, actually. I am going to, I think, build on what you've each said in slightly different ways, but with many few numbers, and I'll try and keep it brief. My basic argument to you is this. I mean, it has turned out in some ways the US, Mexico, and Canada have become more disconnected than ever before in the past year. I mean, our borders certainly are more unpredictable, more less transitable. They are not as closed as they seem, but they're also not as open as they usually are. Somehow, for I think the first time we've seen in recent years, we've seen a decoupling between supply chains, between trade and commercial goods and people, right? I mean, many of us sort of assumed that borders were borders, right? I mean, I think we thought if you're going to slow down borders, you're going to slow down everything. But they actually managed to sort of decouple trade links, which have continued robustly with some, there's certain supply chain issues early on, but these were not primarily border issues. These were primarily about other things in the larger supply chain, while the movement of people has been much more variable, right, and much more challenged along the way. So on one hand, you've seen sort of a decoupling of, or a loosening of the ties among the three countries. But the big point I want to make to you is actually the three countries are becoming much more similar in terms of how they deal with migration. And Rodolfo's presentation, I think, really points to some of this. I mean, there was a time when we talked about migration in North America. We were probably talking about lots of Mexicans trying to get to the United States, crossing the border unauthorized, right? That was the conversation 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It was a conversation. It's still the conversation that is imprinted on the brain of many of us of a certain generation who grew up talking about, North American migration was, yes, it's the US and Canada, people going back and forth, or maybe it's the similarities between the US and Canada, but it was also about Mexicans coming unauthorized to the US. That is less the case today. Now, it is true Mexicans are the top group in the unauthorized numbers right now, but there's a lot of reason to believe that it's all adults, very few families, very few unaccompanied minors. There's lots of reasons to believe that this is probably a temporary phenomenon. I mean, knocking on some wood here, I could be wrong about this, but probably there's some policy changes around Title 42 that probably incentivize that, as well as some short-term shocks in Mexico that have given people reason to want to move. But generally speaking, the era of Mexican out-migration seems to have slowed significantly over the past, 15 years. Now, there's still lots of Mexicans, as you saw in Jack's presentation, who come to the United States with visas, with green cards. They're about 250,000, give or take, any given year, who come on seasonal work visas. Mexico is not the same as the United States. No, more Mexicans probably want to go to the US than Americans to Mexico if you add up all the numbers. But there's a lot of Americans moving to Mexico too. I mean, it turns out there's actually quite a number of Americans moving to Mexico, which we'll come to in a second. So the countries are more similar than they've ever been before. There is no question about that. Mexico is increasingly becoming an immigrant society like the United States and Canada. Of course, it's far from being like the United States and Canada. Certainly Canada, where it is, over a fifth of the population and probably headed towards a quarter of the population born abroad, or the United States, where it's between 13 and 14%. Mexico, it's still, if you look at the census figures, it's about 1%. Reality might be a little north, somewhere between 1 and 2%. It's still small. But as you saw in Rodolfo's numbers, this is changing, right? Mexico is becoming a country that people are moving into. And you can tell this some places more than others, right? I mean, depending where you are. I was in Tapachula a week ago, and Tapachula in southern Mexico is filled with Haitians. Okay, now some of those Haitians, probably most of them, and the Haitian nationals are passing through, right? They're trying to get somewhere else. But there are some that are settling down, right? I mean, there are Haitians that are living in Tapachula. There have always been Guatemalans living in Tapachula, right? And people from Tapachula and the surrounding areas living in Tecunumán on the Guatemala side. But there are parts of Mexico where you begin to see the immigrant imprint, the Haitian community in Tijuana, the Cuban community in Ciudad Juarez, everyone in Playa del Carmen and Cancun, people from Central America and Venezuela and Cuba and all over. Monterrey has a lot of Venezuelans. Mexico City is a bit of everyone. You start to see this, right? It's not like in the United States, it's not like Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, where you walk down the streets and you realize that the world is with you, or New York, right? Where you walk down the streets and you say, the world surrounds me here. But you do begin to see this in a way that you wouldn't have 15 or 20 years ago, or even 5 years ago in Mexico, right? In a way that it begins to be noticeable. Now, this has some interesting consequences. I wrote a paper with Carlos Heredia recently for Wilson Center publication, where we talked about the three countries having a reason to begin to think about migration together. And we're part, MPI is part of a task force led by a Canadian group called the World Refugee and Migration Council, Lloyd Axworthy's group, that includes also the Center for U.S.-Mexico Studies at UCSD and the Inter-American Dialogue and Colegio de Mexico and others, where we have been looking at, it's called a North American and Central American Task Force on Migration. The notion that sort of North America and Central America actually have something to be talking to each other about, but that North America, the US, Canada, and Mexico are sort of one unit and Central America is another unit. Now that's different. That's very different than 15 years ago. 15 years ago, we would have talked about Central America in the same breath as Mexico, right? I mean, a few central, Salvadorans and a few Guatemalans who are coming across the US border along with Mexicans. Now we're starting to talk about how Mexico, the US, and Canada might problem solve together on migration issues in the hemisphere, especially vis-a-vis Central America, right? And so it begins to be a different conversation. And so I just want to point that out. I think this is a change in modality. I don't want to exaggerate it. Obviously, the number of people, most people from Central America and the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean who are on the move northward are headed to the United States. Some people stay in Mexico because they think they can't make it to the US because they already have family or friends in Mexico, or because their situation is so severe that all they want is protection somewhere and Mexico is their first stop. Some people make it to Canada, right? There are historical flows, particularly of Salvadorans and Haitians and others, to Canada. So some people do go to Canada, either seek asylum or come through traditional visa channels. But generally speaking, the US is still the preferred destination. Mexico is still a society that both has people leave through regular channels and arrive. And Canada is a little bit separate from this, right? As a good friend of mine used to say, no offense to anyone in Canada, Canada is really an island, right? It's got fish on three sides and the US on one side. So it is not a literal island quite like Australia, but it operates in immigration terms a little bit like Australia, right? It is somewhat shielded from land border movements of migration, right? In a way that many places in the world are not, including the United States and Mexico. So these are not equivalent realities. I don't want to take this, I don't want to make my statement go further than it should go here in saying that Canada, the US, and Mexico are looking at the world the same way when it comes to immigration. That is clearly not true. But there's increasingly common cause in North America, and increasingly more similarities than differences, particularly vis-a-vis the rest of the hemisphere, right? Now, I should say in parenthesis, most migrants in the hemisphere, by the way, are not actually coming to the US. I mean, most migrants in the hemisphere have been going to Colombia and Peru and other points in Latin America and the Caribbean, because Venezuelan migrants, the largest number of people who have left their country in a forced migration in the hemisphere, have been headed other places in Latin America and the Caribbean, not as much to the United States and Canada. That may be changing, by the way. I mean, keep your eyes open on this. This is for those who follow migration patterns in the hemisphere. There is a growing number of Venezuelans who are coming to the US border. This is in the past 2 or 3 months. It's actually started a little before now, but the number was tiny. It is now significant. And as we know, once movements start, they can often continue and reinforce. And there are people who came in another period into the United States. So keep your eye on that. But generally speaking, those movements have actually been within the Americas, other than Canada and the US, but including Mexico. But there are large movements from Central America, Haiti, Cuba, and other places headed to the United States, which increasingly affect Mexico and to some extent affect Canada. What will the three countries talk about? I mean, and there is a conversation, a live conversation going on between the Biden administration, the López Obrador administration, the Biden administration, and the Trudeau administration. And I suspect at some point there's going to be a North American summit in which migration will be one of the topics. And all three administrations will, figure out some trilateral deliverables, and they'll sit down and talk about this. I would say there's at least 4 things that are worth talking about in North America about migration, that are, and maybe I'll add a 5th to it. And I'll just do this very quickly in the interest of time. One is legal pathways. How to create legal pathways. We know people from Central America are going to be coming for a very long time, and probably true from Haiti as well, are going to be coming to North America for a long time. So how can we create legal pathways that give people an alternative to irregular migration? Canada is already the biggest recruiter of seasonal labor from Central America, much bigger than the United States. 5 times as big in Guatemala as the United States. The US has had negligible seasonal worker programs for Central Americans, vast seasonal worker programs for Mexicans, negligible for Central Americans. Canada has been much more engaged with Guatemala and Honduras. Here's a real target of opportunity. And a lot of Central Americans go to Mexico as well. I was in Guatemala also about a week ago, and Huehuetenango in Guatemala. I mean, people have always gone to Chiapas, but they also are going increasingly Cancun and Playa del Carmen to work, right? I mean, some people don't go to the US, some people actually look to go other places. So how do the 3 countries talk about legal pathways, update their legal structures, begin to think in coordinated ways, allow people maybe to sign up in coordinated ways, for different kinds of programs? 2, protection systems. How do we think about protection systems, both strengthening asylum in the region, what Rodolfo talked about? I mean, Mexico's asylum system is heavily under stress. I was at the asylum office in Tapachula 2 Fridays ago. I mean, it is, Mexico has really picked up the bag for the United States, which largely closed its asylum system at the border. So how do the countries, the other 2 countries in North America help Mexico? But also, what do all 3 countries do? How does the US turn on its asylum system? Is there a refugee resettlement which can be done out of Central America under what criteria? And there Canada has an enormous amount of expertise, which would be incredibly useful. Clearly, the US is going to have to carry most of the burden, but Canada can really do a lot, both to add some capacity, but also add some expertise in refugee resettlement, which would be very useful as the US tries to rebuild its refugee program. 3rd, thinking about building migration systems. Historically, we've flown in DHS agents to help, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras think about their migration systems. There may be ways in which it is more appropriate for Canadians to be part of this conversation as well. This actually happened at a different moment. I remember when Mexico was trying to invest in its public security institutions. One of the things that proved very useful was having the Royal Mounted Police from Canada doing advising of the Mexican government. Why? Well, the US was also advising, but in many ways, there were more similarities to what Mexico wanted to do with Canada. There were fewer sensitivities to outside interference with Canada and the United States. There may be reasons to think about in migration management, even enforcement and control management of borders, that maybe Canada has some experience that would be very useful with Central American countries, in a way that the US may raise some antibodies and may take things in directions that may not always be optimal. And finally, I would say the development question. Canada is a country with enormous development experience and enormous credibility on these issues. The US and Mexico have been talking about what they can do together to invest in Central American countries. And I think that is a huge target of opportunity to think together about what to do in terms of rule of law and development. And let me add a 5th thing, and then I'll close, which is, I think there's also a large agenda that the 3 countries should be thinking about together vis-a-vis the rest of the region, particularly because countries like Costa Rica actually, after Canada, has the largest foreign-born population in the Americas, about somewhere around 15%, according to our numbers. It's quite significant, actually, but a lot of that is Nicaraguans, and there's been a huge surge of Nicaraguans. Almost all the rest of the region has Venezuelans, including Mexico, who are forced migrants. Almost not every country, but much of the region has Haitians and Cubans. There is a real opportunity to help countries think through their immigration systems, to help them think through immigrant integration systems, particularly countries like Colombia and Peru that have gone through and Ecuador and Chile to some extent, which in Costa Rica have gone through very rapid transformations in the past few years. And this is a common cause that the 3 countries of North America might want to make as well, to help those countries in the region that are dealing with the refugee and forced migration flows of nearby neighbors. And recently we saw Canada actually hosted the refugee conference for Venezuela, the Venezuelan Refugee and Migration Conference, only about 2 weeks ago, and has played a leading role in this. The US is the biggest donor, and Mexico is one of the major recipients. There's 100,000 or more Venezuelans living in Mexico right now. Most of them have arrived in the past 5 years. So this is something that is on everyone's agenda in slightly different ways. So let me just conclude by saying, I think this is that were similar, and Mexico was the problem child, right? With people leaving and coming north. Now today, actually, yeah, we're actually fairly similar to each other. we're different in many ways, right? I mean, each country is different in its immigration policies, different in its demographic profile, different in its immigration preferences. But in reality, we're all similar countries. And in fact, the US and Mexico, between the US and Mexico, I'm actually not sure if there are more Mexicans headed north or more Americans headed south. I mean, Rodolfo, that would be a good project to do at some point, to figure out which way who actually has the net gain in migration these days. Now, many of course, the Americans moving to Mexico are children of Mexicans who are moving back. So, I mean, there's more interrelationship, but in fact, there may actually be a net gain in Mexico right now from immigration from the US. This is a very different relationship than we thought about 10 years ago. This is a very different relationship than we thought about 5 years ago. And there's a huge opportunity for Mexico, Canada, and the United States to be thinking together on some of the practical issues of how we manage migration, and we manage the pressures for migration, the drivers of migration in Central America, but also the reception patterns in the rest of the hemisphere. So thanks.
So, Andrew, thank you for that presentation. Rodolfo and Jack, thank you all. That was incredibly rich presentations. And we already have questions coming into the chat box. So if you have questions, please send them to the chat box. And I will start with the first question, which is, what is the success rate so far for applications for refugee status in Mexico? And
Yes.
I turn that over to Rodolfo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, LeRoy. The success rate for these immigrants for application for refugee status in Mexico is dependent of the origin country, and is very diverse because, for example, the Venezuelan immigrants in Mexico, they have more than 90% of success rate in Mexico. So almost most of them, they are received their refugee status. Contrary to the Central America, for people from Honduras or El Salvador, the success rate is very low. I would say around 30% of them, they are receiving the refugee status. And perhaps another in the middle is people from Cuba. They are more 60%. But right now, because an old agreement between Mexico and Venezuela, they receive right now more than 90% of success for this application for refugee status in Mexico. I'm sorry?
Do you have a sense of where refugees are going, since so many of the shelters are already full?
Oh, yes. Right now, because the prevalence of COVID in Mexico, they are going down. So we have a process of opening shelters in some border cities. So many people of this are reaching people from Central America to reaching the Mexican border region. They are still trying to reach one of these shelters, but if they cannot reach this shelter, they are doing a rental small rooms in the cities. And only in Tijuana right now we have in the crossing of San Isidro and Chaparral, we have a big camping area of Central American people waiting for asylum petition in United States. There is a big camping. The tents of, I don't know, is between 1,500 and 2,000 people living in this camping area. We can talk about this. And right now, this is the most difficult area right now on the border. In other areas, even the Mexican government have established some new shelters, as in Ciudad Juarez. They have a very big shelter, and it's not really full. They are receiving still people from from the South. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question deals with the population of retirees, essentially, and what impact they will have, I guess, in terms of migration flows on the NAFTA countries. So has anybody done any looking at where they're going, the economic impact of retirees, whether or not they're full-time or half-time residents?
Well, I know we do know that a lot of the Canadians that end up moving to the United States are a combination of people who are retirees and people who are the most mobile segments of the Canadian population, right? You get a fairly highly educated segment of the Canadian population that ends up moving to the United States in terms of the migration numbers that I showed. But in terms of the retiree group, a lot of them are sort of, as we call them here, snowbirds, right? Who are sort of part-time in the United States. They want to maintain their health insurance here, so they abide by the rules and return when they need to return and go back when they need to go back or desire to go back. It's been interesting during the COVID period that probably the biggest frustration for a lot of those people who have condos or other, or residences in the United States is the challenge of crossing the border. It's probably one of the most vocal groups that we've heard over the course of the period. So it sort of suggests this transnational elite group that does exist, probably with Mexico and the United States as well. Right? There's sort of a transnational elite of Canadians that are part-time Americans, maybe Mexicans part-time, part-time Americans. Although it's a different, I'm talking about a different type of group than the sort of migration flows you see from Mexico to the United States and vice versa regularly. But a lot of those people are particularly frustrated by the border closures. Right? And actually, one of the border mayors was mentioning this morning that he recalls that, back in the day, you could just cross the border between Canada and the United States with a driver's license, right? You didn't have to go through the whole sort of, since 9/11, the passport security checks was nothing along the scale of what it is today. So although that didn't impede, border crossing, but, in terms of what the questioner is raising about health insurance costs, and we'll have to see what the global impact post-pandemic is about issues of health insurance. I don't see it. I don't see the impacts on the debates about Obamacare in the U.S. My American colleague Andrew would probably be much better positioned to answer any of that. And in Canada, if anything, where health is not as much a market-driven thing, I think people are really valuing our healthcare system in light of what's happened during this crisis.
In Mexico, I mean, the Americans and some Canadians tend to move back. The wealthier Americans, I mean, and wealthy is a relative term. People who are not of direct Mexican descent, who are not born in Mexico, move to sort of 3 or 4 big areas. They move to the San Miguel de Allende area. They move to Nayarit, to the sort of Puerto Vallarta area. There's a few cities there. And they move to Jalisco in an area relatively near Guadalajara. And then Mexico City, right? Mexico City is attractive for a lot of reasons. That said, probably the largest number of people that move back, those are the most visible Americans, right? I mean, there's probably 20,000 Americans and Canadians in between 10 and 20,000 San Miguel de Allende. They're very obvious. They tend to be white. They tend to be, they tend to dress like Americans, they tend to sort of cluster together. But probably the largest number of American retirees who moved to Mexico were people born in Mexico. Right. I mean, so lots of people who've lived in the United States their entire life, they've become either U.S. residents or U.S. citizens. They have American children. They will often move back to Mexico, and they move to, where Mexican migrants come from. They move to, a place in Jalisco, Michoacan, and, all over Guanajuato, and, all over the traditional migrant centers in Mexico, and really everywhere in Mexico. But because U.S. law, I mean, sort of like with the Canadians, right? I mean, not when it was Canadian healthcare, Medicare you cannot actually use outside of the United States. I mean, this has been sort of an ongoing question. There's lots of hospitals and doctors and clinics that cater to Americans, and people get lots of treatment, within Mexico, both Mexican origin Americans and non-Mexican origin Americans. So people will often get medical treatment. But obviously, as people age, they also worry about long-term care and things like that Medicare will cover in the US and won't cover in Mexico. And so there does tend to be this sort of bouncing back and forth a little bit of people who their primary home may be in the United States, or in Mexico, but they still often go back. Someone I know personally, for example, I mean, went back, got cancer, and went back, got treated, and stayed with her son for months, and was better, and then came back to Mexico. And that, it's fairly common. They may or may not have a place left in the U.S., but they will go back and live with one of their kids, if they need treatment or go to a nursing home in the U.S. So it's never quite as permanent as it seems, except for people, of course, who are of Mexican origin, who may be better off being taken care of by family members in their hometown. But even often what you see there, and as Rodolfo could say, is, even people who say, I'm going to retire in Mexico, right? Yes, I've lived 40 years in the US, I'm a US citizen, and my kids all grow up speaking English. I'm going to retire back in my hometown. They move back to their hometown in Michoacan. They have a great time. They love catching up. They're the, successful person, but they also miss the United States. And so often even those folks move back and forth quite often. So it's a fluid space. It's a lot of people. I mean, we should assume we're talking probably in the hundreds of thousands, or certainly tens of thousands, but possibly low hundreds of thousands of people who live at least part-time in Mexico as retirees. But split between those groups, between people who are Mexican origin and it's a return to roots, and those for whom it's a chance to upgrade their style of life.
Well, I hope we have time for one more question. Jack, interrupt if we don't, but.
I think one more and that's it, so.
Okay, all right. So this last question deals with really one of the truly issues of our time, and that is global warming. And so the question is, what can, I guess, all three countries do about migration issues within the context of global warming? Would an answer be more aid to Central America, continuation with building a wall? What are solutions that I guess we need to be looking at and talking about to deal with migration?
Can I jump in here quickly, Roy, just because I have to hop off? And let me just say quickly that the link, particularly in Central America with global warming, is less sort of people being forced out en masse. It is much more the unpredictability of rainfall, right? I mean, getting some very heavy rain some years, more hurricanes, more extreme conditions, and then much more drier weather other times. And so what is happening is farming becomes more unpredictable, livelihoods become more unpredictable. People get indebted at the beginning of a farming season, and then it doesn't pan out and they're left with debt. And so it's sort of less this sort of massive push out as it is one more factor that's a trigger in people's lives, right? It adds into all the other factors that are there. And I was talking to a bunch of coffee farmers a couple of weeks ago in Guatemala about this. I mean, it really is, and people are very aware of this, by the way. I mean, it is, no one says I left because of, or my family member left because of global warming. What they say is we got into debt and we had to leave that year so we could cover it, or it's just becoming more unpredictable. It's still a good living to grow coffee compared to other things, but it is not, but it's not a predictable living in the way it was. And so much of the answer is less about what we do there than what we do here. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is everything we do to try and stop global warming with our own consumption patterns. I mean, there are things we can do there and the things on the agricultural side, but the big question is really in the countries that use the most energy. So.
Perfect, thank you.
And I apologize for hopping off. Yeah.
Good, sounds good.
Great to see everyone.
Good seeing you, Andrew. Take care, thank you.
Thanks.
Jack, I'll leave the last for you. Thank you very much, everybody. But
yeah, I think that's it, folks. Thanks very much, everybody. And thank you, Roy and Rodolfo. And
thank you.
Look forward to seeing everyone in person at some point in the not too distant future.
Sure.
Great.
Okay,
bye-bye.
Thank you, Jack. Bye.
Bye-bye.